Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation to talk to you. Now, we're going to be talking about imperialism and its relationship to the Ukraine conflict. So I guess it's worth just saying at the beginning that part of what I say is going to be kind of general analysis of imperialism, and partly will be concrete remarks about Ukraine and the tactical positions that kind of derive from the analysis. But I think there's often a lot of confusion in discussions among socialists and between socialists and others about the way in which a general analysis relates to a particular tactical positions. And I just want to kind of make a kind of how should we put it, prophylactic remark before we start, to point out something which I'm sure is familiar to every active socialist, and that is that general analysis doesn't always, in a direct and linear way, give you tactical conclusions. In fact, often tactical conclusions can seem at odds with general analysis. To give the famous example, Marxists at any rate are people who believe in abolishing the wages system, but very few Marxist activists find this a useful slogan to raise when you attend a picket line. I've been down recently supporting the Hackney bin workers here who want a 10% rise. I'm not going to go down there and say, well, actually, my general analysis as a Marxist is that we should abolish the wages system. This wouldn't be a sensible procedure. There is a link between the two. It's not that we simply talk one way out of one side of our mouths as general analysis and another side of our mouths as tactics. There is a relationship between those two things, that if people gain confidence and combativity and organizational capacity through winning a 10% wage rise, they're more likely to listen to arguments about the necessity of abolishing the wages system. But it's a reminder that tactical positions and general analysis don't always flow directly from one another in a linear manner. Okay, so having said that, I want to start with the most basic and elementary definitions of imperialism. And the important point here is that the imperialist system derives directly from the fundamental structure of capitalist society. If you didn't hear it from Karl Marx, you must have heard it from Margaret Thatcher. Capitalism is about competition. It's about how different units of capital, often in this day and age, very large units of capital, compete for profits, markets, cheap raw material, cheap labor, and so on. Ford competes with Volkswagen, competes with Honda, competes with Nissan, and so forth, and so on. And the fundamental point, I guess, that both Lenin in his book on imperialism and basing himself to a large extent on Nikolai Bukharin's book on imperialism and the world economy, the point that they made is that increasingly as the system ages, this competitive drive is fused to a competitive strategic and military operations by the capitalist state, that economic competition breeds strategic, political, and ultimately military competition, often resulting in direct warfare. But they made a couple of points which are worthwhile thinking about, certainly in modern terms, I think, about the way in which the system did that. And they pointed to a kind of fundamental contradiction in modern capitalism, because they said it both leads to a growth, huge and exponential growth in the world market, and that's been no different in our era than it was in Lenin and Bukharin's era. The era of globalization, they didn't use the term, that's the modern term for it, the spread of the world market, the penetration of capitalist competition into every corner of the globe, is an established fact about modern capitalism. So one element of modern imperialism for Lenin and Bukharin was the spread, the growth of the world market, and both of them spend considerable amounts of time in their work statistically elaborating that fact. But they also thought there was a contradictory tendency at work in modern capitalism, and that was for the capitalist cartels to be integrated with the state in ever closer ways, sometimes directly by becoming state-owned, nationalized industries. But they both made the point that whether or not the state formally owns the large cartels, they are of such scale, their interests, collective interests, if you like, represented by the banking system which finances them, that even when formally private, they depend to a very great extent on very close collaboration with the state machine. Now, again, I don't think I need to elaborate at any great length that this is even more advanced in our age than it was in Lenin and Bukharin's age. So we have a very, very powerful and extensive world market, a very intense phase of international competition, and a very close relationship between the capitalist corporations and the state, and therefore of the ability of the state to deploy armed weaponry, to deploy armed force. Now, this obviously has been historically an uneven process. It's not the case that every capitalist state has equal weight. It's not true that they represent equal economies. It's not true that they emerged into the capitalist world market or became capitalist states at the same time. Indeed, I suppose one of the striking things about the modern world economy is the degree to which the old centers of capital accumulation, North America and Europe, are still hugely dominant. One of the transformations that we're watching, perhaps, is that for the first time ever, a non-European or non-North American state, i.e. China, is now challenging for the kind of global predominance that those old centers of capitalist accumulation have previously been the sole exponent. But as I say, it's still a striking fact that the old centers of capital accumulation are in many ways still dominant. And that means that there's been often at first, directly colonial relationship between either what were in the early days of capitalist development in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, non-capitalist states, increasingly in the 20th and 21st century, capitalist states, but weaker capitalist states. In other words, what was previously a formally colonial relationship, i.e. that the major most advanced capitalist powers directly administered weaker states and weaker economies to their own benefit, has, at least since the decolonization after the Second World War, become a neo-colonial relationship where the threat or use of force and the deployment of economic advantage has still allowed the centers of imperial hegemony to run the system. And I guess that is a kind of broad outline of what the imperial system has looked like. It's still the case, if we look at certainly at some recent wars, the NATO war against Afghanistan, the United States and its allies in the invasion of Iraq, the destruction of the Gaddafi regime in Libya. These are patterns of imperial behavior, which it's not hard to find correlates for in earlier phases of imperialism. I guess one of the developments in the post-Second World War period is that there have been formally independent states, often former colonies of the imperialist powers, that have their own indigenous ruling classes, their own indigenous capitalist classes, capitalist states. And it's an important part, I think, of any analysis of modern imperialism to look at the ways in which those have become both sometimes found themselves, often unwillingly, in opposition to the major imperial powers, often also find themselves to be conduits for imperial power into weaker capitalist societies. The history of Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq shows both these facets, both a willing helpmate of the Western imperial powers and then a sometime opponent of them as well. And I guess that's a feature of modern imperialism, which needs to be analysed and taken account of in a way which is more true now than it was when imperialism was characterised by direct colonial rule. I guess that's all I mean say at the moment about the general shape of the imperial system, characterized by huge concentrations of capital in the old industrial, in the first industrialized centers, bar some late 20th century and early 21st century developments in China, India, and so forth and so on. A colonial relationship which still persists between the major powers and the weaker powers in the system, if not in the form of direct colonial rule. So the system is, and Lenin makes this point about all imperialist wars. He says, in a way, it doesn't really matter who the aggressor is at one level, at a certain level of abstraction. It doesn't matter who starts it, because what starts it is actually a competitive dynamic economically and politically in the system. Wherever it happens to kick off, it's actually that systematic competition which has driven it to the point of military conflict. Now, of course, these are very general observations, and if we're to account more completely for the various phases of imperialism, we would have to study the outlines and indeed the details of the various phases of imperial power. And I guess you would have to enumerate as some of the most important and decisive of those phases, the original construction of direct colonies in the, I suppose, reaching its peak in the 19th century and culminating in the First World War, or as E.H. Carr described it, the 30 Years' War, encompassing both the First and Second World Wars and the Great Depression of the 30s. And I think he was right to see that as a connected series of crises, which only passed into a second phase, the Cold War, with the Allied victory in the Second World War. So we have the classic phase of colonialism and imperialism. We have the phase of the Cold War. We've had a post-Cold War phase in which American hegemony was obvious, and the American state attempted to deploy that military hegemony to reorder the world in its own image. I think it's true to say that that phase has probably concluded with the American defeats in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the emergence now of conflict between major powers with the war in the Ukraine. I don't mean to say that America isn't still the overwhelmingly dominant military power in the system, but I think we have crossed some kind of watershed when we've moved from the kind of wars that dominated the post-Cold War period, the Afghan-Iraq wars, that is, wars between an assembly of the major powers in the system and very, very much weaker and subordinate powers in the system, and a clash between the NATO powers and Russia, which, whatever the weaknesses of its economy, is a major industrialized power, a major military power, a nuclear power, part of the G8 until they were chucked out in the worsening of relations in the last 10 years. So I think those are, if you like, the long arc of imperial development, and some remarks about the nature of the system as we see it now. I think the system does correspond in its general, at the moment, probably corresponds to the general kind of characteristics that Lenin and Bukharin talked about, more closely than perhaps it's done since they made their interventions. We do have an more or less complete globalization of the capitalist economy. There are no non-capitalist states. They are locked in a global struggle for hegemony, and the state and the corporate powers are very, very closely intertwined. You only have to look at the reaction of the major arms manufacturers to the rearming of Germany and to the increased plans for military expenditure as a result of the war in the Ukraine, the way in which Saab and other Swedish arms companies are eyeing the prospect of Sweden joining NATO, to see that in all its contemporary relevance. So I'll make a few remarks now about the Ukraine, and I just want to return first of all to the point that I started out with. The fact that we are in the midst of, that we are characterizing the system as a globally competitive capitalist system in which the use of, or threat of the use of armed power by the states is part of the general competition of the system, doesn't mean to say that either all states are equal. Certainly aren't. And it's not, it would be a bizarre requirement of such a theory to think that all the states competing in the world system had to be either of equal economic or military capacity. That's simply not true. And if you think back over the history of European colonialism, you can think of a wide variety of imperial formations. You can have the classic form of the British Empire, but you can also have Belgium, which had a considerable colonial empire, but has never been a hegemonic power. You can think about Germany before the First World War, which was the major industrialized state in Europe, but had relatively few colonial possessions, and indeed that was a driver of the First World War. So it's simply to say that when we describe the system as a competitive economic system, just as when we decide a capitalist economy is a competitive economic system, it doesn't mean to say that all firms or all states or all economies are equal, and it's not a reason for not characterizing them as imperialist that they aren't as big as the biggest imperialist, or that they have a different configuration than some of the historical examples of imperialism that are most well known to us. So that's the first point that I'd like to make. The second point about the Ukraine war, I think, which has become very much more obvious in the month that it's taken place, is that this is now a conflict between the Russian state and the NATO alliance, using Ukraine as a proxy. I'm not saying that there's no question of the right to self-determination involved in the opposition to the Russian invasion, but increasingly as time has gone by, and the meeting today at Ramstein by the NATO powers underlines this, and indeed the United States position that it's no longer fighting for even the withdrawal of Russian troops or Ukrainian nationality, but its war aim is to weaken Russia. That's been explicitly now said. So I think it gives you the character of that conflict in the way that it's developed over the month that it's taken place. I guess the other element that I want to talk about is the kind of tactical response that socialists should have under these circumstances. And I think the position which Lenin, pioneered by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, that the main enemy is at home, is vitally important, especially for those of us who are in the part of the live in the societies that are part of the biggest military alliance on the globe. It's very important that we are clear about this. There is absolutely nothing to be gained for the labour movement as a whole, for the left in particular, by any other stance, because it inevitably leads to class collaboration. It's not a question of who started it. It's a question that the system generates such wars, and that patriotism in these circumstances is a way of gluing where it possibly can the allegiance of working people to their own ruling class. And the attitude doesn't require us to be uncritical of other capitalist states, doesn't require us to be uncritical of other imperialisms. If you read Karl Liebknecht's speech where he elaborated this, he has things to say about other imperialist powers, but he's very clear that the job of people who are in any particular country is to fight their own ruling class. I think there's a particular danger in the way in which some left debate takes place these days on social media, which gives people the idea that they're no longer rooted, that they're no longer citizens of anywhere, that they exist kind of free floating in the social media and are sitting like Zeus in judgment on the world below, and they hand out opprobrium where they think it's morally required and praise where they think that's morally required. That's a deceptive and fundamentally false view of the world. We are all, in the end of the day, citizens of somewhere. We live somewhere. We are part of labour movements in particular countries. We can vote in particular states. And that gives us a responsibility, primarily because nobody else can, to form an opposition to our state. We said this when we first launched the Stop the War Coalition in the Afghan War. No Afghan, no Iraqi can deal with the British state in the way that the British Labour movement and socialists in Britain can do. It is simply a fact that anything we say about the movement in other places, which we may want to give, will want to give solidarity to, but we're not effective there. Here, it's a matter of deeds. There, it's a matter of warm words most of the time. So the primary responsibility of every socialist is to take on the propaganda and the activities of its own ruling class. And that may sound, it may sound in the way that I described it at the beginning, as if that stands in contradiction to saying that there's a global system in which every part of it is embroiled in the imperialist competition that leads to war. But it's not really. If the Russian anti-war movement deals with Putin, if we deal with Johnson, if the American movement deals with Biden, that's the basis of real internationalism. It's the basis of real international cooperation, actually, between anti-war movements and socialists in other places. Any other policy would lead to a kind of circular firing squad. What would we make of a world where British socialists were responsible for dealing with Putin, Russian socialists were responsible for dealing with Biden. American socialists were responsible for dealing with Johnson. I mean, it's an obvious absurdity. We have first and foremost the business of dealing with our own ruling class. And if every labor movement and every socialist in every country deals with their ruling class, that will be the most powerful basis for a united internationalist opposition to the imperialist system. Okay, I'll leave it there.